These are the people that do all the B-roll, my friends in Frederick, Maryland.
Nice.
And,
okay. Do you want me to take that?
Well, I can show it to you, and then whatever I wanted to show you what they do, and
So you don't want me to keep this?
if you don't, I can get you a copy of it. Originally, I wanted you to see what they do, and I can get you a copy. But they have done this for all the Air Force. So they can go into, people who have been in Korea, Vietnam, Gulf, whatever, and she has all the B-roll. The lady and her husband who own this company.
Do you want me to keep that or no?
No, I'm going to mail it to you.
Okay,
I got to get another copy from her. That's the only one I got. Yeah.
Okay.
But I just wanted to let you know we got some quality B-roll. And she, before she founded the company with her husband in Frederick, Maryland, was on active duty and responsible for all the B-roll for the Gulf War.
Okay.
And she worked for me.
All
It's
right,
good
first,
stuff.
I want to make sure we got
Sure.
your name.
Yep.
So Rick Kiernan, tell me how you spell your last name.
Kiernan. Kiernan.
Okay, you guys are good? Okay. And primarily what I need to get from you over the next few minutes is we're going to walk through the timeline.
Sure.
So that's kind of what I want to do.
Okay.
So let's go to about mid-1990. So maybe it's June, July kind of thing. Where were you at that time? What was your assignment? Yeah.
This whole thing started in August of '90, on the 8th of August, when President Bush said we're going to have a line in the sand. At that point, I was in the Pentagon, and then they decided that between August and December, we would have Operation Desert Shield. At that point, we said, what do we need? We're going to start deploying troops. We're going to start going over and following the president's directive. So the Department of Defense people put things in order.
Okay, hang on though. What was your role at the Pentagon?
I was the Chief of Media Relations for the United States Army in the Pentagon, where General Bono was the Chief of Staff. Pete Williams, who is now NBC Beat Justice, was our boss as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs for Dick Cheney. My boss said, go down and see Pete. I was the first augmentee from the Pentagon to go to Saudi Arabia for the care and feeding of 400 journalists from around the world. So we had the 17 journalists who are normally assigned to the Pentagon Beat, the David Martins and those guys, going over, but then we had all of the other journalists because we had activated the reserves and National Guard. So now we had the Des Moines Register, Topeka, whatever. So my job as the director of the Joint Information Bureau in Riyadh was to get accreditation for those journalists that wanted to go over, to be General Schwarzkopf's spokesman, prepare him for his media interviews, and then coordinate all the other coalition public affairs people from the other countries. So off I went, and that was called Desert Shield. The accreditation was one of the key elements because when I got over there, we had to wait for General McCaffrey in the 24th Division to ship his tanks and mech vehicles by ship. So that took more than a few days. We had some soldiers on the ground, some of the paratroopers, 18th Airborne, some of the initial infantry. But I figured there'd be at least 3 phases. There'd be the deployment phase going over that the media would be interested in. The assimilation phase where they get into getting acclimated to the heat, the culture, the camels, everything that was over there, less any operational things. And then there'd be a sustainment phase. How do we keep them interested until the tanks and everything get here before January of '91 when ultimately we had a ground war? So that period of time was very important because the media wanted to fill the news hole with something. We had all the troops on the ground. We had to make sure that on 30, 60, and 90-day visas, we were able to get the media to and from their stories because we were limited by billeting and by getting them either as pool or separate individuals to the story. And then the big challenge is there was no story. So this was a challenging time in order to talk about the qualitative nature of an operation this big. It was exacerbated by the fact that we had called up not only the active people, but reserves and National Guard from each of the states. So we had a total army coming in, but a group under the Goldwater Nichols that had never been all together at one time. So General Powell, as the chairman, had shaken out the blanket, activated the folks who normally would go off for training every 2 weeks and whatever, and for the summer, now said, okay, we're going to call you all up and deploy. So it was a good time to take a look at the total Army and its capabilities. After we had them all into the country, one of the challenges for the media was to understand that there were host nation requirements. They couldn't put the First Amendment in their back rucksack and bring it with them for access. We had to respect the people who gave us the accreditation, the visas, and all of that. So the Pentagon folks understood this, but they're a small group of 17 or 18 of the people who actually live and work in the Pentagon on a beat, so they're familiar with the process. But the other journalists were anxious to get a story, either seeing soldiers in the field, interviewing General Schwarzkopf, or anything to satisfy their editors back home who had spent a lot of money to commit them overseas, get the visa, and go through that process. So the Joint Information Bureau was really, in my mind, very crucial to this because it was much different than the conflict that I experienced in Vietnam. In Vietnam, you had a polarization for the American people as far as news goes. You had the 5 o'clock follies in Saigon, where the journalists who were there in Saigon, living in the Rex Hotel, would tell their version of what was going on in the war without ever having gone out to the field. Now we had a whole new generation 20 years later, from 1970 to 1990. Only a few of them had been with me in Vietnam, the Joe Galloways and a couple of others who had been in Vietnam with me. So I had a new generation of young journalists, but the key was, thanks to Mr. Williams and the guidance from Secretary, we were able to give them access. So the big contrast between Vietnam and the Gulf was the accessibility that the journalists got, and ultimately the American people would get information that was up to date, accurate, and firsthand. The next step that I felt was strengthening for our function as public affairs is that they had trained us in those ensuing 20 years to be the professionals. They sent me to school to get a degree in mass communications. So now I'm in J schools with journalists. So they respect me and I respect them, and we're both off the same sheet of music. Before, a public affairs person was more or less relegated to the grip and grins with the general getting a big check for the United Way. Now the public affairs man was involved in copy points, preparing the generals for their interviews, and being a liaison really for the American people and making sure they got the word. So there was a mutual respect between the journalists and the public affairs folks that we had in theater. I think the most important thing, though, was that there was a unanimity. There was a speaking with one voice quality. My challenge was, in different time zones, if a question came for General Schwarzkopf and I in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to make sure that what was said by us at the podium was supported and in concert with what General Kelly was saying back in the Pentagon with Pete Williams. And so there was a triangulation and coordination of information for every single interview we had for General Schwarzkopf. It was a fast pace. We did 23 interviews in 4 weeks. That's a lot of interviews to prepare a 4-star general for. And to make sure that we went through triangulation back to Bill Smullen, who was General Powell's Public Affairs, and then to Pete Williams, who was Mr. Cheney's. So those three had to be in sync. So we had General Powell, we had the Secretary, and General Schwarzkopf. And I think it was valuable for the media to see the consistency and for the American people to get the one voice, that we had a strong coalition, we knew what we were doing, and our allies were with us. Additionally, to make sure we were really wrapped tight, I would have coffee each morning with Don North. He was Prince Khalid's public affairs person, who was General Schwarzkopf's counterpart. Therefore, if the media had an interview with General Schwarzkopf at 10 and with Prince Khalid at 1, they were together as far as their plan, what their strategy was, and how they were going to execute it. So I think what was communicated to the American people and to our allies around the world is that we had a very clear mission, the liberation of Kuwait. We had a wonderful coalition of troops and assets to do it. We had a schedule, and we had a plan to do this. So there was no stray voltage. Everything was on track. One of the most important things that General Schwarzkopf put into place that we executed was once a week we would have an ICC, Information Coordinating Committee. And that's where I would sit down and look at the copy points of where we were in that sustainment phase, assimilation phase, operational phase, and that it was in sync with the PSYOPs, with the psychological people who were putting out the leaflets, the radio broadcast, and all the things to the populace, so that there was no different voices and no different messages going out. The coordination of those messages was very important. So what was being said through the journalists to the American people was the same thing that the Saudi Arabians were hearing in the marketplace. So the ICC was very important. And in contrast to Vietnam, there was not a disparate distribution of information. It was all together.
Wow. Okay, so let me take you back just a little bit. So the Joint Information Bureau, was
Correct.
that the first time?
First time we ever had a JIB, and I was their director. Best job I ever had in the world.
Wow. So did you started it? Did you recommend that that's what? Tell me the genesis behind JIB.
What's wonderful about the Pentagon with 27,000 people is, and you're a colonel, the guidance is very general, which is from Mr. Williams, God bless him, our boss, wonderful man. All right, Rick, it's Wednesday, you need to leave on Saturday, you need to get over there, I got 400 journalists, you need to get your arms around them. That's the guidance. So off you go. The wonderful thing about it is that when you get there, one of the strengths of public affairs as a function compared to Vietnam is that we had all gone to the same Defense Information School at Fort Meade, Maryland. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine public affairs people. So when I walked into the Hyatt Hotel in Riyadh, into a second floor room, I had 12 people. I had Mike Gallagher from the Air Force, I had Mike Doubleday from the Navy, I had a gunny sergeant from the Marines, and I had 7 other folks to work the desk with me. First time we'd ever been in the same room together. And that became our JIB. And we came together each day, but we had all been to the same instruction in the Public Affairs Defense Information School, which has been first at Fort Slocum, then it was at Indianapolis, and now it's at Fort Meade, Maryland. So by having a school functionally where everyone is on the same sheet of music, in photojournalism, in media, in broadcast, we have all done this. We have all had our own television shows. We have all done stand-ups in the Pentagon. So we were all good to go. Then we had a reserve press camp headquarters from Birmingham, Alabama, with 14 more men and women who came in who had been activated to be part of our JIB. So we came together, we coalesced, and we had our daily meetings on what interviews were there for General Schwarzkopf, what reviews and what research did we need to do in order to prepare him for that interview. Then we had to sit with the journalists and say, okay, let's narrow the universe. We're not talking about all 9 planets. We want to make your time and your 30 minutes with General Schwarzkopf valuable to him and valuable to me. What is it you want to talk about? Okay? And so we did the research. We made the most efficient use of the journalist's time and General Schwarzkopf's time. But by having that Joint Information Bureau, which was a first, we didn't have it in previous wars, it gave us the speaking with one voice quality that makes public affairs the strength that it is.
Okay, hang on just a second. I had my phone off and it decided to start up again.
Could be Pete Williams saying that. That's Pete Williams. He said, that's not the
Jeez,
guidance
I
I gave Kiernan at all.
Little moon thing. So I'm just turning it off. Okay, so I want to go back to that. Start off again with the, because I don't know how much that you heard that. I hate that because I want you to talk about.
And you got to be careful with public affairs people, because one of our weaknesses is you ask us what time it is and we tell you how to build a watch.
Right, which you do very well, by the way. Okay, so go back to the Joint Information Bureau. How much did that joint information strategy have an impact on how the American people supported the war in a way that they hadn't before?
I think it had a lot to do with strengthening the war because we were all looking at the same dot on the horizon. So there was not mixed messages, and I'm not maligning Vietnam and the wonderful service that we all performed over there and that the journalists themselves did. But I think you would get a version of a story from Saigon, from journalists who maybe were not in the field. You would get another version back in Washington, as because of technology, what the reports were as far as airstrikes, pacification, how many places in Vietnam are now safe, are we winning the war against the North Vietnamese, are the Viet Cong going to go on? If you're getting mixed messages, or I'll say disparate messages from various sources, then I think the reader, the listener, the American have to sort it out. And then they have to validate that by what they see with individual soldiers coming home. We did not go over as a unit. When we deployed over to the Gulf, they were beginning to do what we now do in Afghanistan and Iraq. They would deploy the 24th Division with General McCaffrey from Fort Stewart, Georgia. And smartly, we had Joe Galloway with General McCaffrey. So he watched the soldiers, he was with them. And Joe had been with us in Vietnam, great man that he is, a good friend, dear friend. And then with the 101st with General P coming out of Fort Campbell, we had the air assault, we had the helicopters. And so he had his journalists. So there was a validation and a confirmation of what they were seeing in the field and what was being reported back home. And I think that was a strength for the American people. It was done in a very efficient way. And I think when we look at the general text and context of a strategy described by General Vono as a chief of staff of the Army, who provided the assets and the soldiers of a trained and ready Army to General Schwarzkopf, who was the CINC, the Commander-in-Chief for Central Command. It was the first time under Goldwater-Nichols where the services were not subjugated, but provided the resources to a CINC, a Commander-in-Chief in a certain AOR, area of responsibility. So General Powell, the President, Secretary Cheney, this was a way in order to provide trained and ready resources so that the operators like General Schwarzkopf, General P, General McCaffrey, General Griffith, the folks that had to execute the operations did not have to be distracted by having to worry about the training, the capability, the caliber of the soldiers, men and women that they were committing to the operational forces. That was taken care of by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Chief of Staff of the Army, Chief of Naval Operations, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps. So it was a wonderful way to look at the process, what was going on in Quantico, what was going on at Fort Bragg, what was going on back in the States. And then when they were, quote, trained and ready and deployed, then the CINC, the Commander-in-Chief, was prepared to deploy those forces wherever they were needed. Prior to this, we would have to do it concurrently. So while General Saint was in Europe, and he had to worry about downsizing USAREUR, U.S. Army Europe, concurrently he was deploying folks to the CINC. So it was like the wheels on the back of a watch. Everything was in synchronization. And that's why it was done so efficiently between August 8th with a line in the sand and the middle of January when the war was completed after 96 hours.
Okay, so take me back to Desert Shield.
Sure.
You're there in Saudi Arabia?
Yes.
Okay.
Hotel, Hyatt Hotel.
Nice.
Good stuff.
So what were your personal thoughts about what the buildup was about? Did you think it was just more of an exercise in deterrence, that, oh, Hussein's just going to say, oh, I give up, I'm going to leave? Or did you actually think that Hussein was not going to give up ground and we were going to war?
No, we believed the most extreme steps would be taken by him. He'd already demonstrated the type of dictatorship and the type of operations to the people in the region, but we had a very specific message and mission, which was the liberation of Kuwait. It wasn't let's pacify the region, which was Vietnam. Let's pacify the 44 provinces in Vietnam that are south of Hanoi. This was an incision. This was take care and liberate and put all forces necessary to liberate Kuwait. So it was very precise. And we did not work in vacuums. There's a lot of coordination so that when we speak to the journalist each day, I would sit at the staff meetings every morning with General Schwarzkopf while the intelligence, the operations, and all those other staff officers at the 3-star level would brief. So my job was to take the current operations situation, weave it into what I would tell the journalist, because the journalists are there to fill a news hole. The Pentagon correspondents understood the glossary and the vernacular of operations and deployments. They knew those kinds of words and verbs that end in IZE. 90% of the 400 journalists that were coming in and out had not been exposed to the military before. So there was concurrently an education of someone from the Des Moines Register or the San Antonio Light or the Sacramento Bee that we did not have in the Pentagon, because the beat people know it. The David Martins, the Miklashevskis, all were part of it. My challenge was to bring Katie Couric with me, who was with WRC from Washington, D.C., who was schlepping a camera around, and she was in her first trimester of her first pregnancy. So that was interesting. But she's a wonderful journalist, as time has proven over the years. But Fred Francis, who was her mentor and boss, was the one that said, okay, you should go over and accompany, Colonel Kiernan on this. So we had two types of media: those that wanted to go to the pool and observe things, those that wanted to wait in a queue to have an appointment with General Schwarzkopf on a very specific topic. And so the management of those interviews and the management of who goes on the pool and getting them back safely kept a lot of balls in the air at one time. And then each one of them had a different visa, 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, because we had a limited number of hotels and billeting for these people. So they were in and out. They were all on deadline. They wanted to get their stories, and we had to see that they got it efficiently and effectively. So there was no lack of dynamics and things going on at one time. But to go to your point on the private processing of what it was, there were very long hours, because when I was doing my things at the end of the day in Riyadh, in Saudi, this was an earlier time in Washington, D.C., as Mr. Williams was preparing General Kelly for his briefing. So then there was going across the street to the MODA, the Ministry of Defense and Aviation, to brief General Schwarzkopf, just he and I, each evening. And we would say, sir, tomorrow we have Mark Thompson from Time, or we have this reporter, these are the topics he would like to speak about. We have already coordinated with General Powell's office, with Bill Smullen. We've already coordinated with Mr. Williams and Mr. Cheney's office. And these are the copy points. These are the messages on this particular topic that we would like to discuss in the morning. Now, when they came for their interview, there was the mutual respect and confidence that when the reporter wanted to talk about 1, 2, 3, he was not going to walk in and ask questions 4, 5, and 6. And that happened only one time. And that is to benefit no one. And so the coordination was the challenge. The hours were the challenge. And I think keeping up with the operational, keeping an eye in the rearview mirror as you're moving forward to January of '91. The soldiers, the men and women who worked in the JIB were extraordinary, talented folks. And what I loved about the Reserves and National Guard, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to say it, they were very, very valuable in that 50 weeks out of 52, they were the station manager at a TV station. They were the managing editor of a newspaper. Then they put on their uniform for 2 weeks and may have been called up and been deployed. So I was getting currency, expertise of the finest caliber. Not that my active folks did not have that as well with their daily operations, but some folks would say, well, you had reserves and National Guard. In public affairs, that is a strength, because I have a reporter who's been a reporter for 20 years, and that person falls in and helped me maintain my currency on the media that I was dealing with. So it was a very symbiotic relationship where we supported, there was a lot of mutual respect between officer, enlisted, reserve, National Guard, and the active force.
Wow, you make my job easy. I don't even have to ask you anything. Oh my gosh. Okay, take me to, I want to know, understand better your role with General Schwarzkopf.
Sure.
And was it one-on-one?
Oh,
with you
yes,
and him?
every
Tell me,
night.
what was that like?
It was wonderful.
What did he want from you?
He was wonderful. I should, of course, and this is going to be a one. I love the anecdotes, and I love having had the opportunity as an officer on active duty. I miss it every day, but to have had the opportunity to work with 8 4-star generals in my career was amazing. With General Schwarzkopf, General Bono, General Griffith, General Riscassi, General Tillele. I mean, to have the opportunity to work with senior men who are so smart in every aspect and to learn from them firsthand is invaluable. But when I first met General Schwarzkopf, he's a big man, and he has sadly left us, but he's watching over us. And he's a big man, physically, and in his presence and his personality. The Navy captain who had worked with him in Tampa, Florida, before the Central Command was activated, introduced me to him, and he was Navy captain equivalent in rank to me as a colonel. And we went to meet General Schwarzkopf, and he said, "This is Colonel Kiernan. He is going to be the director of the Joint Information Bureau that works with the media." And being a paratrooper from Bragg, one of our greetings is, "All the way, sir." And General Schwarzkopf is not a paratrooper. He is tanks, heavy forces. Airborne guys are special ops, light forces. And the distinction in the Army in those days was light and heavy. So ham and eggs, light and heavy, he looked at me and said, "Are you one of those paratroopers?" That was his first response to airborne. And my response was ham and eggs. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I forgot you were heavy." And I'm looking at a man who's 6'6", perhaps 240 pounds, all muscle. And he looked at me and he said, "Well, this is going to go well." So that was our initial whatever. But he had a wonderful sense of humor. I had the benefit each day of meeting with him at the end of the day. It was just he and I, and we would discuss the interviews. And he was very patient, and he understood that we had to wait for all of the assets to arrive in the theater by either sea, air, or land. And there's just a period of time where you have a little bit of ennui, there's a little bit of boredom, and you got to keep the soldiers trained and active and focused, just like you do before an athletic game or football game. You got to keep them prepped up on practice. And so many times these interviews would wear on the general because it was the same questions each day until we got into the operational aspects of what all generals like him with that experience have the pride and the strength and the activism to use. And so many times it would be, are we going to talk about this? Are we going to talk? Yes, sir. These are the copy points. So he was very patient, very understanding, and understood that the coordination had already been done with General Powell and with Mr. Cheney, and that was reassuring to him. So a lot of what I did with him one-on-one was R&R, respond and reassure. And I enjoyed that because I got to watch how he thinks and how he processes information and his response to it. And that's probably one of the benefits of working as a public affairs person with a chief of service like General Bono or with General Schwarzkopf as a sync, is to watch each of them individually with idiosyncrasies, but each of them processing information and making, at his level, strategic decisions. Others would make operational decisions, others would make tactical decisions, but it was very clear those 3 levels of process. And although they were different in personality and execution, I found with each of the senior people, and those senior folks over there all were promoted to 4 stars after the conflict, there were some similarities in character that I noticed in all of them by having the one-on-one relationship without having a lot of staff in the room. And that was a humility and a selflessness that they all share in common.
Really? Now see, that surprises me. I think of, for instance, General Schwarzkopf as central casting, for four-star general. And humility probably wouldn't be in that package, I would think.
Sure.
So tell me more about how you saw that, and at what point did you realize he trusted you with the information you were giving him and what you wanted out of him?
Each of them receives information differently. I have found in my experience there's two kinds of public affairs folks. There's those that enjoy the limelight and the camera and doing what you and I are doing right now. But I have found that I chose to be the others, which is behind the scenes is best, and to make the individual or the institution look good. And I think they sense that. And I think that listening 75% of the time and speaking 25% makes you a better public affairs person. And instead of having exuberance and wanting to offer information without it being asked, it's always best to listen and let the boss be the boss and listen to his guidance. With General Saint, I had the benefit of working with a lot of the senior people in the corporate world after we all retired. Very precise. And if General Saint or General Schwarzkopf, who are very similar, asks a question on how many Jeeps are in the motor pool, you simply say, "Sir, there are 4 Jeeps." He doesn't want to know, oh yeah, there's 5 deuce-and-a-half trucks, there's 2 tanks, and there's a gasoline pump. He didn't ask you that. So I found with them that by that time and that level, because they've been through so many years of experience at tactical, operational, now strategic level, they're way ahead of you. They already have the puzzle, and they've got 24 out of the 25 pieces already assembled. They just need that one final piece. And you give that to them, and you provide that to them. And I think they also realize that you are a buffer, you are an insulation for them, so that they can be themselves with you, and they can express things to you knowing that it is not on the record, if you will, but they can vent, they can ask for clarification, whereas in a large staff setting, they may not have that opportunity because to the staff, they want to be prepared, be concise, get in, get out, and be very complete in the guidance they give. When you're one-on-one with the communicator, it's very helpful for them to have someone who will listen and then kind of clarify or verify and say, well, I'm thinking of 1, 2, and 3. And you might be able to add, sir, I think that's great. And in context, we may want to add 4, 5, and 6 because the reporter may not be aware of that. And they would say, good, I hadn't thought of it, because they live a very episodic life. And that 23 interviews in 4 weeks is a lot, particularly when it is on the record, in magazines, in the newspapers, on the TV. Not so much TV, but I have found through the years the safest medium that you want to deal with is radio. It's out, it's gone. The one you really want to be careful of is print, because that can be replicated, it can be sliced and diced and extracted and parsed. And then the one that is really the difficult one is TV, because it also can be divided, and visual impact is much more than something that is read or heard. So each of the 3 medium, you had to analyze all of that before you brought the reporter in. And so by having that benefit and that expertise, General Schwarzkopf and the other senior folks respected that no less than advice they would receive from the Surgeon General on medical things or from the JAG of the Army on legal things. And but we had to earn that, and we had to earn that by being responsive, being prepared, and being able to work with the media as a bridge So really you are an ombudsman for the reporter, but you also have to protect the institution, not the man. And we don't have two stories that this is really going on, but here's what I'm going to tell you, because once you lose credibility with the reporter, he or she will never come back to you. You've just lost any access. So if you are honest with the reporter and accurate with them, they will come to you as a source. But if you try and use duplicity, it's not going to work but once. And I think all of those things, you have to earn it with the 4-star, with the senior person in the room. So it does become a matter of mutual respect. But I'm back to the humility and all. It was never about them. It was about the soldiers. It was about the organization. It was about the liberation of Kuwait. It was about doing your job and doing your mission. And I sense that with each of these gentlemen in many, many different ways. They all had different idiosyncrasies, but I found the selflessness and devotion to duty was there and apparent.
Were there any potential communication disasters that were averted that you can think of?
Yes, I have one, and I think it speaks to the process of working with the reporter and the reporter being candid and honest with you as you are with him or her. We had a reporter from a major publication, and I won't mention the paper, but it was a newspaper of record. And this is an unusual situation, but the reporter had a brother who was a commander in the army in Saudi Arabia with soldiers. The reporter was lined up and had his appointment set with the sink, with General Schwarzkopf. And of course, not to control or manage, but what would you like to talk to General Schwarzkopf about? Operational capability, the capability of the soldiers, the logistics, supplies, aviation assets. Just narrow it down for me so we can get you the answers you're looking for, not to manage the news at all. This particular reporter, and I will not mention the name of either, obviously had flown out to meet with his brother, as you would. And his brother was a senior person within the chain, not a lower ranking person in the organization. And of course, brothers will talk very candidly initially. How's it going? Well, perhaps this was said, perhaps. The mail is slow, the water is not cold, the rations are short, the morale could be a little better, whatever. Just the candid conversation between two brothers, one being a journalist and one being a supervisor, if you will. So when we came back for the time for the interview, the questions that we had discussed and mutually agreed upon were going to be topics A, B, and C. And then when we went in, it was always one-on-one, and General Schwarzkopf insisted it only be the reporter, he and I. So there's no one else there, and that's a good thing. And because you've either prepared him or you haven't. And then if it didn't go well, then there's only two left in the room, and that's you and General Schwarzkopf. And when the reporter went in to sit down, the topics were not A, B, and C. They were D, E, and F, and they were the topics that he had discussed. And it was not a good thing. Number one, it was an opinion given by this other person, which is fine. But it was, for the general, it was something we had not agreed to talk about. And so in my mind, it was obviously using information from another source in order to get a reaction. And so that was one of the tougher incidents to work. So we maintained our professional courtesies. It ended shortly. We went back, and then I reported back to the folks in Washington, my bosses, in the public affairs chain, as to what had occurred. And then there was one phone call made from the building to the managing editor, and then on to the publisher, and then that reporter went home. So, and remember, being in the JIB, there was accreditation. So it wasn't you had to be a good guy or a good lady in order to stay for your 30, 60, or 90 days, write a good story about us. It was nothing to do with that. It was simply the logistics of, I've only got room in this hotel for 29 people at this time. So the management of that was one of my responsibilities too. So come in, get your story, and now I got to have 4 more reporters to come in to take your room. So St. Petersburg Tribune is out, and here comes Newsday from Long Island. They're going to, changing reporters. So it wasn't a matter of you didn't do good, so you're leaving. But in this particular case, it was really, in our opinion, a matter of ethics in using confidential information and then trying to bring that to the top.
So was it the publisher or the Pentagon that had him go home?
Pentagon called the publisher.
And said he's going home?
He's, that day.
They learned their lesson?
He did, yeah. And the institution remains the same. The publication, absolutely, no problem whatsoever. But I think, not to speak for or whatever for the reporter, but perhaps he saw a, quote, target of opportunity and, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, but that was one that was a little dicey.
Yeah, so it didn't get published?
No. And, but I must say this also, Charlene, is that the Sync understood, that perhaps he and I were set up. And it wasn't as if Colonel Kiernan had not done due diligence. It's that, this was an end run, and wow. So, because it first and only time.
Wow.
Yeah. But it was lose-lose. Nobody wins.
Yeah, okay. Okay, January 15th. January 15th comes, and Hussein has not left Kuwait. And so what's happening in your mind? Was that a big day for you, where you go, we're going to war? I'm now heading up the communications for this new effort?
No, now at this point, we have moved the JIB from Riyadh in December to Dhahran. We have now relocated physically to get closer to operational things like that. And Riyadh has now it's a different physical location. Now I have returned to the Pentagon and resumed my responsibilities for the Army as the Chief of Media Relations for the Army while the ground war gets underway. A phenomenon has occurred and we had to deal with it, and this was the phenomenon. Once again, I think public affairs did something that had not been done before. We broke new ground. When I returned, all of the first team from the Pentagon Correspondence Corridor in the building, they have a corridor, they were still in the war zone. The same publications and broadcast units were represented in the Pentagon. So I still had New York Times, Time Magazine, CBS, ABC, NBC in the building, in the Pentagon, for the briefings with Mr. Williams and General Kelly. But these were the cooking editor, the movie review editor, the travel editor, good men and women and good journalists, but they were not the military beat reporters. They were all overseas. So in the afternoon, I began to notice that when they would ask a question, it was not their fault because they weren't familiar with the glossary. So they didn't understand logistics, operational, tanks, aircraft, soldiers, caliber of weapons. So the questions were not pertinent, and the questions were very, very general, and it made it difficult for whoever was at the podium, General Kelly or Mr. Williams, to respond. So I knew it was really a little embarrassing for these reporters who have been put into these positions in the Pentagon. They've never been in the Pentagon, and they're very good men and women, but they didn't understand. So I instituted Army 101, and on Saturday mornings I invited them all in, off the record, coffee and cake, and we're going to start with, this is a soldier, 10 soldiers make a squad, 4 squads make a platoon, 4 platoons make a company, 5 companies make a battalion, 5 battalions make a brigade, 3 brigades make a division. That was first class I gave. To them, off the record, they could ask me anything they wanted. How old are the soldiers, this, that, and everything. The next week, I brought in Rod Blank, who was a colonel. He became our Surgeon General of the Army, to talk about medical things. This is triage. This is a MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. This is a medevac. This is a helicopter. This is how we treat people in the field. The next week, I brought in a logistics man. This is how much fuel one tank needs to go 1 mile. This is how many gasoline I need for so many trucks. The next week, I brought in the aviation man. So each of my weeks, it was off the record. They could ask anything they wanted. Then the questions got pertinent. I understand you've moved 5 tanks operationally from here to Kuwait City. How did the fuel get there? Was it delivered by tank also, or was it airdropped? Then the questions became pertinent. I understand you had 4 wounded and all that. Where's the hospital to which they were evacuated? How many medics do you have? How come you didn't have a doctor there and 4 nurses? So the reporters felt great because now they knew the secret sauce. Now they knew what to ask. And our people felt better because we could now talk about the Army, not just the shooters, but we could talk about logistics, supplies, legal, what were the host nation requirements, SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement. They didn't know those things. But by giving them a class every Saturday morning, I now had a stable of subject matter experts who felt comfortable with the reporters, and the reporters now felt like they really had been through basic training.
That's brilliant.
I was very proud of that.
Oh my gosh, okay, now when did you do that? Was that January?
January.
So that was leading up, because you knew
Yes, yep.
that the air war would get started.
I was in phase 4. I'd gone through deployment, I'd gone through assimilation, I'd gone through sustainment, now I was in operation. I'd written this down on the plane going over.
So, because you knew
Yep.
the war game, you knew,
Yep.
you knew that,
Yep.
but they didn't.
No.
So they did not know that you were setting them up for the ground assault.
No.
Wow.
That's
Okay.
called OPSEC, Operational Security. And it's very difficult for a public affairs person, and I'm glad we have this opportunity, because too many times we do work behind the scenes, but trust me, there's a lot of prep work that goes on. What we do, the men and women in our field, I'm very proud of them, we represent only 1/2 of 1% of the Army. The 82nd Airborne has 13,000 paratroopers, all great men and women. They have 1 major who's a public affairs officer, and he has 2 sergeants that help him take care of 13,000 paratroopers. So it's like an iceberg. You only see the PAO doing 1/5. 4/5 of it is going on below the surface, and you know, it's like the duck on the water. Looks real smooth, looks real cool, but he's paddling like heck underneath.
Well, and communications is such
Oh.
an integral part of war.
You only get 1 chance to say it. And you can't come on and say, well, what Colonel Kiernan meant to say was this. Now, another technique that I felt was different in contrast to previous wars, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, is Vietnam, for example, World War II, you had censorship, okay? I've put together a little book called Headlines from the Front Line, and it talks about the history of public affairs and media. So you had censorship. You had people who went through, blacked out things, letters home and all that, World War II, and Korea. Vietnam, you had no censorship, no censors. And so you saw warts and all. When we got into Vietnam, then when we got into the desert, we then had pool. First time we'd ever pooled, put 10 or 15 people in a bus and taken them to the 24th Division. We had Joe Galloway with General McCaffrey sitting in on his briefings, just like Eisenhower briefed the reporters on D-Day, but it was embargoed until D-Day got off on June 6th. So there was that mutual respect. So we were able to give them access to the battlefield. Those that did not want to go out in the buses, we only had a limited number, but could stay back, get an interview with General Schwarzkopf. So we were serving the American people. The reason it's a symbiotic relationship is we need the reporter so that we can get the word to the families, the friends, our citizens, our taxpayers, the people who need to know what we're doing. I can't do it without them. And I learned early on, there's 10 times as many reporters as there are PAOs. They need me for access. They can't write a story unless they have access to the soldiers, to the story, to the troops. One of the innovations that Mr. Williams came up with, which was, I thought, brilliant, we have a saying that is, the medium becomes the message. Rather than have a talking head doing a stand-up, we trained soldiers, sailors, airmen to be spokespeople so that a reporter would say, how's the training? Well, instead of a colonel or a major or an officer saying, our training's great, we had this score on our training test and all that. If you have a high school graduate who's a PFC or a sergeant saying, I'm trained, I'm ready, I have confidence in my sergeant, and my lieutenant is the best there is. I feel good about my buddies that I'm in a foxhole with. That has much more credibility than when you're talking about your shipmates. You're talking about the guys on the flight line with you. So we use non-PAOs on screen because the medium became the trained and ready army that General Vono had built. And so by using those men and women as the medium for the information, you told the story right there, how great this young lady was as a sergeant.
So you gave public affairs training to everybody?
Select. My favorite was General Butch Neal, one-star general who later made 4 stars and was the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps. Wonderful man. And Mr. Williams said, okay, keep the jib going, keep coordinate, get General Vono, get him ready, take care of the media, the care and feeding of the reporters. He said, but in the same way we have General Kelly back in the Pentagon, he was not a public affairs guy, he was a 3-star general, he's now deceased. But he had come from a newspaper family in Philly. So Tom Kelly was a great guy. But it was more credible to have him than Mr. Williams, always behind the podium. Pete was there whenever we needed him, or the secretary. So the public affairs principle there is, you don't want the general to be the spokesperson on every story, because then you have nowhere to go. The general said, that's it. Whereas if you have the public affairs guy out there and says, we have 4 trucks and a Jeep, and you don't, then the general can come in and say, what Rick meant to say was this, and correct the record. So you have a buffer in whoever your spokesperson is. So we took General Neal, and it was like a charm school, so we trained 3 or 4 from each service, and we said, sir, you're the winner. So whenever we had some briefings to do, we would have General Neal as our 1-star. And so one of my additional duties, and he's a dear friend to this day, was to get Butch prepped. And he was wonderful. He was just a wonderful guy. And we had the benefit of, in our second career, of having him work at MPRI with us too. So Butch was just a wonderful man.
Was this a new approach, different from other wars?
Yeah, usually your spokesman was your spokesman. And you see it now to the effect where you have Josh Earnest in the White House.
So the Gulf War was really the only one where you really actively employed?
I would say, to summarize, Charlene, that I think there were some initiatives and firsts, if you will. The jib, I think, was, it spoke to coordination. Of course, I had Tony Garrity from England. He was the PAO, and so I had to speak with Tony. You know, they do things differently. And then I had, Prince Khalid's guy. So how you pass information is not always the way we do in the United States. So I think the Joint Information Bureau, the coordination of various services, bringing them all together, having to accredit the media, whereas here in America, you know, they can show up anywhere they want. I mean, you might have seating at the White House or State Department or whatever, and there is certain access you have, but that's here in this country. Here it was specific accreditation that we were in charge of, public affairs. The other one, I think, was the Army 101, the basic training of of reporters who were not familiar with that beat, if you will. No less than if we took a Pentagon reporter and asked him to write a movie review. It would be difficult. I think the third thing was using the soldier, sailor, Marines, and the great enlisted people that we have on occasion to speak to the training, their quality of life, their organization, and the pride that comes through with their battle buddies, the pride that comes through from their shipmates, the pride that comes through of having a female tech sergeant on the flight line responsible for navigation. Those things come through more credibly when you use a non-spokesperson, if you will. You can always use a spokesperson for official business, news releases, announcements, press alerts, whatever it may be. So I think that technique was very effective. I think the unanimity of speaking with one voice was most apparent between Washington and Saudi Arabia in the field. And then I think it was taken to the next level in subsequent commitments in Afghanistan and Iraq by Brian Whitman, wonderful, wonderful Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs for years, where Brian used embeds, and that's where you embed the journalists with the units. So they would see firsthand through their own eyes the daily life of a soldier, Marine, an airman, or an aviator, what it was like. So I think over time, an evolutionary way, we have permitted the American people with more transparency on our military force. We're very small. When we were in the Gulf, we had 545,000 men and women as an end strength for the active Army. And that has now been diminished. There's been cuts over time, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years. So I think it's important, we haven't had a draft in over 30 years, it's important that our servicemen and women not be separated from the people they serve. When I was a young man, you would come down my street in my neighborhood and there would be, in a group of 10 homes, 3 or 4 where there was some military affiliation, either a dad from Korea or World War II, a son serving in Vietnam. There was a draft, so you had selective service and sign-up. You go down my same street, when I go back to my hometown, there's one or none that has a connection with the service. And I think it's important for the American people that we have a small standing army that is in proportion to the threats that we face. But I think it's that informal communication of watching a young man leave high school, go to his recruiter, come back from basic training, do his service and return to the community, and that man or woman make a contribution. That says something about the service, the skills that they learned, the respect for authority, the teamwork, the camaraderie, all the things they learned from 4 or 5 years in the service. I've seen it with our own daughter.
How much advance notice did you know when the ground war was going to begin?
The operational, very good question. Usually, in the past, for example, the public affairs folks were not inside the wire, if you will. They were very much with the operational planners, and they had to be, because you were a long way from home. It was certainly based on technology and satellites and things that we had in the 90s that we did not have in the 70s, that there would be immediate notification when things got underway. But in the Pentagon, we knew, within several days, I would say, and it has to be up to the sink. It's imminent, but you're not quite sure, and they have to wait for many variables for the stars to be aligned. But to answer your question, more aware than we were in previous conflicts, and I think that's important so that you can prepare what ifs. One of the things they teach us in public affairs school is the what if file. What if your commanding general, his Jeep turns over and he's killed? What's your succession plan? At Fort Jackson, what if the 10,000 trainees that you have, and I was the public affairs at Fort Jackson, which is a training environment, what if there's an epidemic of the avian flu? It's a what if file. What do you do? And in the corporate world, we used to call it hit by a bus. You know, who got hit by a bus? Who's going to take over? And but we are much more in the wire. I think we're much more recognized by the hard work and the good work that was done by the young public affairs professionals that we have now. I can't say enough about the contribution that the school makes, Defense Information School. It was the first function within Department of Defense where everybody went to the same school. We used to have a separate logistics school for Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Now we have DLA, Defense Logistics Agency at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. We used to have military intelligence, naval intelligence, Air Force intelligence. Now we have the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. So I think practically from a budget point of view, it's good not to replicate, quadruplicate the things. We now have a defense media activity right across the street from our public affairs school. So Armed Forces Radio and Television, Soldiers Magazine, All Hands Magazine, Airman Magazine, all the publications we're working on with Darryl are now all under one roof. And that does a lot. It's back to the speaking with one voice. And it says an awful lot about keeping up with the technology, if you will. But I would say Armed Forces Radio and Television, you go back to Good Morning Vietnam and the movie and all that. When you're overseas in the days, sometimes Armed Forces Radio and Television was the only link you had back to America. And so that was important. And I think we've seen the technology change with it. But I think very subtly, I mean, the public affairs school has been around 60 years, and that was the very first one where early on they knew they ought to have everybody in the same Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines in the same one. And it's one size fits all. You can change parts either way. Like I reported in the JIB, I'd never met those 12 people before in my life, but we all had been to DINFOS.
Now you mentioned the what if.
Yep.
You probably were prepping for more casualties than actually happened.
Yes.
How does that, I mean, how do you prep for talking about casualties and then a whole separate outcome? Well,
you have dry runs, you have simulation, you have exercises on mass casualties, and you worst case it. And when you look at courses of action, with each course of action that is considered, you have to say, okay, well, look at Desert One, when General Schwarzkopf was a one-star general, when the helicopters went down back in the early 80s. General Schwarzkopf was a one-star general. Desert One, Grenada. Go back to some of the other incidents where we had in the early 80s things in the desert that did not go so well.
So that's what's going through your mind as you're prepping.
Sure.
That whole week before the ground war?
Sure.
Yeah, tell me more about what did you think? What were you expecting would happen in those first few days of the Gulf War, of the ground assault?
Well, because the enemy does not have the same transparency or communicate any type of information, you assume the worst. You always have to assume the worst. Would there be any type of chemical? That's always the worst, chemical. You know, your young men and women in the desert have enough on their back and their rucks. If they're not riding in tanks, they've got to have a protective mask and a gas mask. I remember taking mine to Saudi Arabia and worrying about that. But I think chemical was the first. That was one to worry about because it's so pervasive and so insidious. It's obvious when you have a tank and an artillery piece. You can see those things. You know the trajectory, you know the range, you know the ballistics and the capability. But when you have something like chemicals, you don't know. And we know from stories how many people had been gassed and how many people had been hit like that. So I think that would have been one of the preeminent precautions that we had to take. And there's only certain things you can do and limit that. You don't want to minimize the climate. You don't want to minimize 112 degrees every day and what it does on your body for water and sustenance and the amount of distance you can walk on foot. You don't want to minimize sand in an engine of a tank. You don't want to minimize the simple little truck and tanker that follows behind the tanks to make sure they have enough fuel. So all of the little logistical things, it's not so much the operational things. So you have to change your mindset when you worry about these things. And then how do I handle announcing mass casualties? How about NOK, next of kin notification? How about were they all from a reserve unit that is not used to going to war, coming out of Peoria, or coming out of Champaign, Illinois? That's different than being at Fort Bragg, where they know they're in harm's way when they deploy. The 18th Airborne is called that simply because they have to be anywhere in the world in 18 hours. That's how they got their name. XVIII. I was their public affairs for 4 years. And I'll tell you a quick one there. The media is always looking for a bellwether. They're always looking for a scoop. They're always looking for whatever. So when I had Ms. Currick in the Pentagon, she learned a lot very quickly. And the 18th is always the bellwether. If anything's going to happen anywhere in the world, Fort Bragg is on alert. And it's just the first to go. That's why it's called the Contingency Corps. The others fall into place. The aviation at Fort Rucker, the 101st at Fort Campbell, the 24th at Division, or Fort Sill, O'Turley, everybody has it. But aviation, Bragg, 18th, you got it. So anything's going to happen. So having been there for 4 years, I said to Ms. Kirk, I said, if you really think you're hearing something, and they have more sources than public affairs people, I said, you may want to check with Fayetteville and the Domino's Pizza on Post Road. She said, why would that be? I said, let me think. And I could not say. If there's going to be someone deployed, the units are put on lockdown. Soldiers can't go home. They got to stay in their barracks. They got to get their parachutes packed. They got to go to Green Ram. If you want to know anything going on, check with the pizza joint, Domino's, on Post Road, Fayetteville. And if they have just jumped to 400 pizzas with cheese and anchovies, we're going somewhere.
That's hilarious.
There it is.
I love that. Okay, hang on a second. What time do you have?
12.
Oh shoot, I gotta be over at this lunch.
Go ahead.
Well, what I'm wondering is, because I know we still have a lot more questions, can you take over asking some questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, why don't we do that?
Sure.
But he needs to look over here, is that gonna work?
Of course.
Okay, because I want him to keep asking you about the rest of it.
Is this helpful?
Yes.
I think it's
Yeah,
an aspect that's not much discussed.
You're an important part of tying everything together.
It's not much discussed.
Especially,
The role,
yeah. So
function.
let's keep going with that.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Do you have any time constraints?
I'd say maybe in an hour to be
Here, this
to
is
be
my
heading
one
up
big
the
thank
road.
you.
Oh, you're the best. Thank you,
We
dear.
do, some chocolate.
And I'll
But we need to talk.
I'll work the B-roll.
I'm so sad that you gotta head out.
No, it's
Darn
okay.
it,
I got
darn
the
it.
little monkeys
Okay,
here.
Okay.
And then, but that will only be temporary until